How was it doing Jocko's podcast?
Jocko was awesome. Actually, I was introduced to Jocko through a mutual friend, and obviously I'd listened to a lot of his work. And I think when you speak to somebody with such an amazing level of experience, not just in his very distinguished military career, but in the way he's built his own media empire, it's hard not to be slightly in awe at such a guy. But no, it was great. I think we spoke for 2-3 hours. I mean, it was a big one. But he's a guy that really does his research, and he'd read my book back to back, and came up with some pretty insightful questions. So
Yeah, I love his interview style because he takes it very linearly. So you pretty much just got a nice dump of your entire career and life.
Yeah.
Is there a camaraderie between the Paras and the SEALs?
I think there's a camaraderie with all military guys that are operating at that elite level. I think there's a mutual respect, and whilst there's always a bit of banter and a bit of healthy sort of Mickey taking, absolutely. We've the special forces, the Paras, the Marines. All sort of operate in a similar sphere, and did similar work in Afghanistan and Iraq. So we had a lot to talk about. Yeah.
How about his mate who does the Martyr Made podcast coming out with such outrageous comments? How does he get in bed with guys like that?
I've no idea. I mean, he seems to have some very interesting people in his network. Yeah.
So you were there to promote The Art of Exploration.
Yeah, must have been a few years ago now. It's probably like 4 years ago, 5 years ago. Yeah.
Did you notice a tangible needle movement from doing a show with that audience, and especially a US audience?
Hard to tell because it was sort of mid-COVID, or it was just before COVID, actually. I think it sort of came out 2020 or something like that. So it suddenly, the world went into tailspin, and so any tangible effect was probably mitigated by everyone getting slightly distracted by that stuff. But obviously, it's great to get exposure in the US. I mean, some of my shows have aired in America. A lot of my books have been published in America, but it's such a big market out there. It's easy to get sort of lost in the fray. So, having someone like Jocko talk about it to his huge audience was great.
Yeah, the Brits have yourself, Colin Thurborn, Paul Theroux, Bear Grylls, many others. Is there a market for this type of exploration, story writing, armchair travel, beautiful documentaries that take you to a part of the world you've never seen? Is there a market for that in America? Who's the Levison equivalent in the US?
I mean, there's a lot of adventure television in the US. Obviously, Bear Grylls has sort of monopolized the global market on that front. He's my neighbour. He's just over there as well.
Is he actually?
Yeah.
Nice.
So we've got a sort of we've got a good friendship, and we see each other occasionally. But it's quite different. It's very much about the entertainment sphere in the US, and so there are obviously incredibly talented people that write really well. There's some great explorers. I'm a member of the Explorers Club in New York, so whenever I go out there, you meet incredible people doing amazing things, and obviously there's a lot more cash over in the States, so they get to do much bigger expeditions. The Explorers Club's a great example. You go there and you've got astronauts, you've got the deep sea guys, you've got James Cameron, who sort of funds it all. So it's a very different level. But in terms of the sort of the space in which I operate, I mean, I never really went into this thinking I'm going to get into that segment or into that particular pigeonhole or niche. I sort of set out wanting to write books, and I've always loved travel, and so the TV side of things was somewhat unexpected, and I wasn't quite prepared to sort of find myself on this journey and figure out. I had to sort of figure out where to sort of slot myself. Yeah.
I mean, speaking of the unexpected, you open up The Art of Exploration with a dedication to luck and chance, in other words. Your impromptu interview with the Paras, not dying in the car crash, taking off as a TV star. What's the role that this type of serendipity has played in your life?
Well, it's kind of fun in hindsight to go back and piece it all together. And I think that's the art of storytelling, is when you see these synchronicities and the causation between all of these events, you could be, of course that happened that way. At the time, it's sometimes more difficult. But what I've kind of learned to do and almost trained myself to do is know that in every situation, good or bad, something will come out of it that you can look back on and find a cause and effect. And that might sound a bit pointless, but actually, it's been quite useful for me as a storyteller. That's kind of what I do, to be in a situation knowing that in 4, 5, 10 years' time, I'll be able to look back at this one point in life and know that the decision I made now, good, bad, or indifferent, will go on to create something. So it's a reminder to live every day in the present. And, when I look back at the role that fortune and luck, of course it is fortune and luck. There's plenty of times when I could have been, dead, killed in various scenarios, but I wasn't. You have to sort of put it down to some sort of faith that things are going to be okay.
So you do operate with this idea that you're inviting some type of serendipity into your life by doing certain things, and there's going to be upside there. You just got to take advantage of it when it comes.
Absolutely, and I think it's all about creating. If you have a vision, if you have this dream that you want to fulfill, knowing that every situation will result in something. Every decision that you make will be meaningful. Now, it's not to say that you might say, well, that actually sort of loses some of the meaning because, what's the point in worrying about every single moment? But I think if you just exude like a good energy and a good and a good sort of vibe and make decisions based out of courage rather than fear, then on balance, things will turn out all right.
100%. You mentioned earlier, or just a second ago, it's easy to trace it backwards, the steps. Of course it went this way, because I know in hindsight how it went, so you can... But do you really know why it went that way? There's a great quote by Søren Kierkegaard that life can be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards.
Correct, yeah. I think it's really important because, as I said before, if you train yourself to know that sometimes it doesn't matter which decision you make, as long as you make a decision. Because inertia is the biggest killer of all dreams. And like when you sort of get yourself in a rut and you find yourself unable to make any decision, that's when people find themselves getting a bit too comfortable, a bit too lazy. And I've certainly found myself in times in my life where that's happened.
Because of the fame and money and notoriety?
Well, I think, if you surround yourself by a bit too much comfort, then you take away some of the motivation to progress. So whenever I get too comfortable, I try and remind myself of that and then push myself into something that I'm not less comfortable with, which then usually results in developing in a new way or learning a new skill. And when you're in your youth, you don't sort of think like that. You sort of, hardship is something that's just simply to be overcome rather than to be embraced. Now I relish hardship in a way that I probably didn't before. I knew I had to, when I was in my 20s, I had things to prove. I wanted to be the best. I wanted to win. I was very competitive. Now I'm only really competitive with myself. I just want to make sure that I'm progressing and developing in a way that I can look back on and be proud, knowing that hopefully in 5 years, if I'm still alive, then I will look back at this point and be proud of what I'm doing now.
I think that way you're wired to really want to seek out that comfort must be a strong leading indicator for the sort of adventurous life. Are you familiar with Phil Harwood? He wrote Canoeing Through the Congo.
Yes, of course, yeah.
So I met him a few weeks ago, very serendipitously. I was in Abu Dhabi. He works there for the Emirati military, training resilience to the Emirati. And we caught up for a beer. And I think he's in his 50s. Yeah. And he the whole time was just saying, I've gotten sloppy. I've gotten weak. I need to get back out there. I don't care if I die. So he's going to, that trip he did through the Congo is as real as it gets.
Yeah, hardcore.
And he wants to go back and do something just as real now.
Right.
For those exact same motivations you just said.
Yeah.
He hates how soft and comfortable he is.
It's true, isn't it? I mean, there's certain times in your life where you have the freedom, you have the energy, and a reason to go and do something really quite insane, and usually it's when you're younger, but I think there's no reason that you can't do, and you shouldn't do, push yourself and do expeditions and do something that's really challenging at any point in your life. And it might be in a different way, learning a new skill, but I've certainly found, I'm less inclined to go away for 6, 7, 9 months at a time now. You sort of stop getting invited to friends' weddings and things. They forget about you. But I think it's finding a balance. But equally, not falling into a rut, not getting too comfortable is really important.
You love this Paulo Coelho quote regarding this exact.
Sort of. If you think. What is it now? It's
If you think adventure is dangerous, routine is
lethal, and it's true, isn't it? I think it's true. I think routine can encourage you to sort of take up habits that aren't healthy, or you can just get yourself in a position where you're not feeling challenged. And I think challenge, hardship, struggle is what gives life its meaning. Viktor Frankl sort of talks a lot about this in terms, and a lot of Stoic philosophy is really all about, without, you're not going to get that sense of growth and development and ultimately joy that comes with learning if you don't go through hardship.
And Jordan Peterson has since pivoted from this message, but the reason he blew up so massively is because that was the exact thing that he was saying, repurposing Nietzsche and Jung, this idea that shoulder the biggest burden you can carry, take ownership, be responsible. And he's spoken about it many times, but hundreds of millions of people around the world just latched onto that message. There's something very deep about it.
I think it's fundamental to a lot of philosophies around the world. Buddhism, it's the obstacle is the way, and the fact that you should in every disaster there's an opportunity, and I've certainly learnt to embrace that philosophy, because otherwise I'd have to really reassess why a lot of things have happened the way they have. But I've genuinely found that during, in the process of going through a number of very challenging situations, that I've personally grown and developed and found myself presented often with even bigger challenges, which you think, oh, what's the point? But with that comes with enormous privileges of being able to help other people and spread a positive message.
Tell me how much I bastardized this story, but isn't the origin story of the Buddha that he was this prince and he had everything given to him? There was not one moment of his day ever where he had to struggle. And his path to, what is it called? Enlightenment was leaving the walled gardens and then embracing the pure asceticism and difficulties and hardships that the real world actually gave. And so you're right, like it's such a perennial story.
It is, no, and I think it plays out in pretty much every religion, every philosophy around the world is when you renounce materialism, when you renounce comfort, and you go out into the desert or the jungle, or go and sit on top of a mountain or meditate in a cave. That's when you get the good stuff. That's when you get this realization of what life is really all about. And then usually you have to give that up as well, because that's quite self-indulgent, and then go back and sort of teach the rest of the world and go and live in balance. And I think that's the ultimate aim, is to sort of bring all of these great ideas, but then apply them to the real world. Because if you're just sort of sitting out in the middle of the jungle or meditating in a cave, that's great, but you're not really part of society, and no man is an island. So I think it's important to strike that chord, and that's something that's I found in my life as a sort of a traveler and explorer, has been this constant juggle between being out in the desert or the jungle and being on expedition, and then being here in central London, and trying to find walk that fine line, which can be very challenging, because people often say, "Oh, what's it like when you get back from an expedition?" I'll never forget when I got back from the Nile. I'd been walking for 9 months. I'd been living this acutely present sort of time where every single step, you sort of you're aware of risks, you're aware of what's going on around you. There's extreme poverty, there's often dangers. Every day is a challenge. You don't know where you're going to sleep, you don't know what you're going to eat. But then suddenly all that comes to an end. I got to the Mediterranean Sea, big pat on the back, and then fly back to southwest London. And then there comes a sort of slight depression with all of that, because you're like, what hard. It's very similar in many ways to when you get back from an operational tour with the army. Suddenly you're surrounded by this sort of wanton extravagance, and people just don't care. And I think in both instances, I then had to remind myself it doesn't matter that other people don't care. It doesn't matter that people don't care that you're off fighting the Taliban or that I was off walking the Nile, because that's all ego. It's like the sensation that I should care, I should be getting validation from other people. You're missing the point. Then I reminded myself, no, I was doing this for myself, and I was doing this to learn something. And then if people want to take note, if people want to be inspired by that, great. But if not, then that's their journey.
Was part of the depression as well this question of what was the point of any of that?
Well, of course. I mean, it's quite a nihilist thing. What's the point in any of it? I mean, I think for me, the point is to live life to your full potential as an individual. And if you've got the opportunity, or if you create the opportunity to do something different, I mean, the words of Jacques Cousteau, the great diver and explorer, he said, if you're fortunate enough to live an extraordinary life, it's your duty to share it. And it's that idea of I feel very lucky. I feel as though I came from a background that didn't deny me any opportunities. Both my parents were teachers, and they encouraged me to understand the value of education, to read, and that was all great. I mean, they didn't have any money. I grew up in a post-industrial city, Stoke-on-Trent, which, and I think that in many ways gave me the inspiration. I was like, there's a big wide world out there. I need to go and see it, and my parents encouraged that. But the idea then, my father didn't have those opportunities. My granddad certainly didn't. He was down, working in a factory or down a mine. I just felt duty bound to go and embrace the world and go and see what a magic is out there. And that's kind of, I feel what I've been doing for myself is probably just fulfilling this childhood fantasy to go and live this sort of quest, because it is possible to live a quest and live in this. It's not, people say, well, it's Peter Pan syndrome, or it's a fantasy. Well, maybe it is, but that's what life's about. It's a game to be played.
Yeah.
It's an adventure to be fulfilled. So why not?
Yeah, we have one tick of the second hand on this planet, And I don't know, are you religious at all?
I mean, I went to Catholic school. That kind of put me off religion for some time. But in my travels, I have definitely learnt the value of spirituality, and I've spent time in Buddhist monasteries. I've spent time in Amazonian shaman rituals and all that stuff, and everything in between. And I've definitely become spiritual, and I've definitely started to embrace and believe that there is definitely some magic at play out there.
So you think you potentially are leaving behind something else than just your work?
Well, I think it's spreading a positive message in any way you can, and I think going back to what's the point of it all question, it's about like helping other people. Really.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that really matters. If as long as you're doing good and inspiring and encouraging other people to be the best version of themselves, then that's kind of all that matters.
I mean, on the point of inspiring, undoubtedly, of the millions of people that would have touched upon, whether it's a documentary or a book or an interview, maybe 1% of them may have had their worldview really, really influenced, changed. And that's pretty special, I think.
Well, I mean, it blew my mind, because when I set out to do, my first, journey, walking the Nile, I had no idea of any of this. I was doing it because it was a great adventure, and I was like in my sort of early 30s.
Yeah.
But it became quite apparent quite quickly the power of that platform. And I'll never forget, I was at a UNICEF charity dinner or something, and one of the Africa team heads came up to me and said, "We've been trying to put South Sudan on the map for 25 years. But having my Nile documentary go on TV, suddenly there was a huge spike in donations, and it was on the news."
Wow.
And that was like,
That's
wow.
amazing.
And then I became a UK ambassador for UNICEF, and I was like, wow, suddenly I've got this great platform. And the same goes across the board. I've had the number of people that have been in touch over the years that have said, "Oh, you inspired me to quit my job at Goldman Sachs, and I've just built my second school in Nepal." I'm like,
fuck yeah.
Yeah.
That's
that
amazing.
for me is like, gives me an enormous amount of reward. And it's kind of often, there's pros and cons, and there's all sorts of strange and wonderful serendipity that's come of it. I mean, I've been in touch by about 50, 60 parents who said they've named their kids Levison, which I never thought. I mean, my dad's very happy, so he's got sort of 57 sort of grandchildren in name, if nothing else. So it's stuff like that I just feel very privileged to have been a part of.
You were just saying how from the Nile documentary, you just transitioned from the Paras and you've done this incredible journey and you realize there's a platform on the other end of it. There's a quote from The Art of Exploration. You're describing the feeling of satisfaction and reward you got when you went from sleeping on your mate's floors to receiving offers and money after the success of the documentary.
Yeah, I mean, I when I left the Paras back in 2010, I kind of had this vague idea of that I was, I wanted to be an explorer, whatever that meant, which I kind of had a bit of a plan for. I sat down and did what in the army is called the 7 questions. So it's whether you're Napoleon invading Russia or sort of just, planning how to build a bridge, you follow the same process. So I did the same with a life plan, essentially.
Okay, nice.
Figured it out, where I want to be in 5 years and then working it all backwards. So I came up with my little plan, which was I needed some cash because I was completely skint. I'd basically invested whatever money I was left over from the army into buying a camera so I could teach myself photography. I started writing, doing articles for things like, Brad Guy's Lonely Planet. Did a bit of wedding photography, some babies, all that stuff just to pay the bills. And I set up a little company called Secret Compass, which was doing guiding services to interesting places. So we were doing like horse riding expeditions to Afghanistan, skiing in Iraq, weird stuff.
Looks amazing.
Yeah, it was an amazing introduction to the world of professional expedition guiding outside of a military context, and 2, business, which I had like zero experience or frankly interest in. But I think in any field as a creative or as an entrepreneur, as a freelancer, you need to understand the basics of business. And so that was kind of my own little personal MBA, was setting up a business, and it did act as a great stepping stone for then doing my own big journey, which was the Nile. But in that period of about 3 years, it was 2010 to 2013. I literally couldn't afford to pay rent, so I was sleeping on friends' floors. There was quite a few times where I had my rule, which I picked up when I was 21 in India, which was staying at the Golden Temple in Amritsar with the Sikhs. You sort of get your first 3 nights for free, and then you don't want to outstay your welcome. So I applied this same concept to my friends because I didn't want to annoy any of them to the point that we stopped being friends. So I only ever stayed with people for 3 nights before moving on. So when you've done the round a couple of times, there was definitely a few nights where I was on Clapham Common sleeping on a bench, which was at the time when I was in my late 20s was fine, but I wouldn't fancy doing it now. But it taught me a lot. It taught me a lot about how to be independent, how to manage running a very small team, but on very limited resources. But then suddenly to have this great opportunity when I walked the Nile, I was suddenly given a huge amount of money to go do a documentary and live my dream, which completely changed my world.
Yeah. Why were you so cash strapped after the military?
Well, I mean, you don't get paid very well in the first place in the military. I paid off my student loan. I basically invested whatever money I had into buying, like I say, bought a new camera. And which immediately got stolen when I was in Mexico, which is a bit annoying.
Must have been a good rig as well.
Yeah, it was a good rig. I'd spent like whatever savings I had on this, and then to move to be in London. London's expensive, and so it's not an easy place to find yourself. So that was it. But thankfully, it all paid off. Whatever little money I did have, I was spending on traveling, and being away and gaining experience and credibility, I guess, in that sphere. Because I think it's hard to make a name for yourself in your 20s, and I'd made a conscious decision not to do any sort of promotion or any sort of like, look at me when I whatever this is all great until I was 30. That was my sort of unreal. And also, when you're in the military, ironically, you don't put your head above the parapet. You don't. So you very much. You're of this mindset. It's not. I don't think it's about being humble, but it's you just don't want to get your sort of get your mates ripping it out of you. So you don't talk. You don't really do any of that self promotion or advertising what you're up to. And that took a big change of mindset.
Mm-hmm. Going from Walking the Nile with various people along the way, but largely solitary, and then writing this book. What type of self-consciousness did you have when you returned with this whole camera crew? Now all of a sudden you're a presenter, and wherever you go, obviously you must draw way more attention than you would have beforehand.
It was an interesting transition because up until this point, I'd always loved traveling. I'd always loved being sort of in alien environments, but quite low profile, because I'd always found that was the best way to immerse yourself in different communities. And then suddenly to have a camera crew there and to be expected to sort of perform in a way was something I had to really get used to. Thankfully, I had a very good director who told me some very good advice. He said, look, if you're awkward on camera, if you're self-conscious, we're just going to have to do it again. So stop wasting your time. Let's just get it right the first time. And then and so I learned pretty quick. I was like, rather than doing it, letting my sort of ego or vanity get in the way and get my hair right. No, just do it. Get it over and done with. Don't worry about what you look like, what you sound like, and just get on with it. Actually, you save yourself a hell of a lot of time in the long run.
So you just mustered up this self-confidence.
Well, you just
said, fuck the bad vibes in the head.
Doesn't matter. You just do it, and ultimately, I found that after a while, you just realise that it's not about putting on a performance. It's just about being totally natural, organic, and authentic, and let the editors do their job to make you look all right afterwards.
Yeah.
But I think that was what kind of resonated with people on the film side of things, was a sense of this was a bit rough and ready. It wasn't polished. It wasn't take 27. Let me just sort of like do this again, and that came across in not just the way that I was speaking and so on, but in the way the whole show was produced. It kind of, a lot of shows, particularly in the adventure survival space, it's all kind of manufactured, whereas mine very much wasn't. I set off and to walk 4,500 miles and let's see what happens. And a lot of it, 70% of that first show was literally done on a little handy cam, very serendipitous. Let's just film and see what happens.
Something as big as this.
Like a little bit bigger. It was on a little flip cams, the old school ones, and that was it.
Right.
and
and
most
audio
of the show
was on your lapel.
Didn't even have audio. It was literally the inbuilt mic.
Okay.
These days I don't think that the TV
that wouldn't fly.
Wouldn't fly. But 10 years ago, that was how we did it. And the crew would fly out, once every month or 6 weeks, or I was in Sudan for 2 months on my own because the crew couldn't get visas. So it was literally all shot on a handy cam.
Is Sudan today Is Sudan today in worse shape than when you were doing when you wrote there?
Yeah, Sudan sadly has really suffered in the last few years. The civil war, which is sort of resurged, has played havoc, and you simply can't go there now. And it's really sad because, my guide Moez, who was an amazing fella, he'd basically set up a tourism business, taking people to places like. The pyramids, in the Nubian areas, beautiful, beautiful scenery, which now is sadly all off limits.
And also your Arabia tour potentially wouldn't be able to be done today.
Yeah. I mean, there's certain places that just come in and out of being on, available, and sadly, the Middle East is it's usually turbulent, but right now, obviously, it would definitely not be wise to go. No. Walking through some of those areas.
Yeah. Anthony Bourdain, John Pilger, if you're familiar with him, Australian documentarian.
Okay.
Not travel, but very journalistic. And Anthony Bourdain, obviously, exclusively travel and food.
Yeah.
In my estimation, what makes those shows so good is with the prose that the monologue and the transfer happens from the host. So for yourself, were you carefully writing down what you wanted to say and then committing it to memory, or was it all improvised every time?
Literally never written down.
Okay.
No. and that wasn't necessarily a conscious decision. I think it was just from the outset. My first director was like, look, don't overthink this. Don't plan anything, what you're going to say. You're not a presenter. You're just you doing what you do, which is walking around. And I had to get that into my mind. It's like, I'm not here to present in that respect. I'm here to convey what I'm seeing in the way that I would naturally see it. And you know, most of the time that was usually through conversations with local people who are simply telling their story. So I've kind of learnt that I'm purely a conduit to let local people talk about their own places. And that's what I've enjoyed probably the most about my travel documentaries, is having local guides who are often not really guides at all. You know, these are just like random people.
Just a bloke who knows the area
just
well.
a bloke who I've picked up, or, you know, like Alberto, my Mexican guide in the Americas. He was a fashion photographer who I sort of met when my camera got stolen in Mexico. He'd loaned me a camera, and you know, he just got divorced and said, "Look, I'll come walking with you." And I said, "Well, have you ever walked anywhere?" He's like, "Well, not really. I've walked to the shop occasionally," but he had literally never walked anywhere. But he was perfect. He just great sense of humor, and I think going back to your original point, it's I just learnt to be just as natural as I could, really.
To the point of Alberto, I read in a written interview that you'd done, that he was going through this divorce at the time and could confide in you. But you also commented that you were also going through some rough times. So where were you in your life when this happened?
Well, this was 2016. So this was my third televised expedition. You know, I'd done the Nile, I'd finished the Himalayas. And I think what was happening was I was on this roll, right? You know, I was always getting asked. I'd come back from a journey. I'd sort of do this big round of interviews and promotion. I'd write my book, do a lecture tour around the UK, and I was on this real high. Bought myself an Aston Martin, you know, living the high life.
Do you still have that?
No, I sold that. I, you know, getting probably a bit too big for my boots, and
surely the para guys will rip you hard for that.
Well, totally, yeah. But it was, you know, I was doing all the society events and all that sort of stuff, and on the one hand, it was all great because I was suddenly living this dream. But on the other hand, it was all getting a bit out of control. It was like every night going out. There was always sometimes like treble booked for charity balls and galas, and it was crazy. And you know, I was suddenly getting paid more money than I'd ever sort of imagined was possible. And then, but really, all I wanted to do was be out in the jungle. and I think Alberto felt the same way. And we were kind of like. And we struck up this amazing friendship back in 2010 when I first went to Mexico to go and teach myself photography, and we kind of stayed in touch a little bit, but we were both at similar times in our lives where we were like, we need to get away from this madness and let's go and do this journey as a form of escape, and that's kind of what we did, and we struck it off, and we're still like best mates to this day. He was over visiting like a couple of months ago, and so I think there are times in your life when you have these people that come in and out of your life to sort of guide you in a certain direction, and I think we both needed this escape to the jungle. Yeah.
Why is Mexico the place to go to learn photography?
Well, it's just a very colourful place. It's full. I mean, I've always loved the Mexican culture. I went there back in like 2006. And I've been going ever since, really. I think it's an amazing country. The people are incredibly welcoming.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
I spent a year and a half there.
Yeah.
It's I think my favorite place in the world.
It's amazing. I've probably been like 15 times, you know, and it's I lived there, I learned Spanish there, and it just seemed a natural place to go and learn photography, and I'm glad I did, because that's where I met my mate Alberto. Yeah. It's been great.
So there's writing, there's documentary, there's the expeditions, but photography is a huge part of your life. Where does that rank as the things you most enjoy doing?
I love photography. I find it such good fun. I mean, I don't really commercialize it in a way that I perhaps could or should, but I don't really care. I just love it because it's fun. It was something I picked up in the last couple of years of being in the army. I just quite enjoyed the process of sort of capturing images and seeing them in print. And I've been very fortunate. You know, I'll never forget when I first set off to before I went to the Nile. I was in New York and I walked past the Leica store and I was like, they look really cool. And then I saw the price tag. But I said to myself, one day I'm gonna own one of these Leicas. And then before I went to set off on the Nile, I thought, well, I should, get a camera sponsor. And I'd already, I'd already bought my camera that had got nicked a couple of years before then. So I went into the store and spoke to the manager and said, look, I'm doing this big expedition. Will you give me one of your cameras? And they said no. So I said, fine. So when I finally got paid by Channel 4, I went and bought one. It was probably the most expensive single thing I'd ever bought at that stage. And
what did they say you back? 10 grand or something?
Yeah, something crazy. It was about 10 grand. And anyway, so I went and did my Nile journey, got loads of nice photographs, got back from the Nile, and the show went on TV. And then, funnily enough, I got a phone call from the boss at Leica, and he'd totally forgotten that I'd been in. He's like, "Oh, we've watched your show, really enjoyed it.
No way.
Would you like to be a Leica ambassador?" So I then became a Leica ambassador, and I've been working with them to this day. Nice. And it's been great because they've loaned me lots of cameras, and I've done quite a few assignments for them. So that's been a great relationship.
And you're editing your own photos as well?
Yeah, I have been. Like over the years, that's not something I sort of. I don't like getting in the weeds too much, but I just try and keep it very light touch on the editing front. Yeah. But it's great fun. I mean, I was in Hawaii recently, and
that's one of yours.
That's one of mine. Doing an assignment for Leica, and that is amazing. I spent like a week flying around in helicopters.
I mean that is a dream. That is an absolute dream.
Taking photos of the wildlife, surfing, climbing mountains. I mean, it literally doesn't get better than that.
You think of like the opportunity cost of you going away for so long.
Yeah.
And bear with me, as a bit of a preamble. So David Yarrow, amazing, probably one of the most sought after fine art photographers in the world. He mentioned this in an interview, that he'd made a career for himself after his kids had become adults and his marriage had failed. And he says that he would not have been able to achieve the success he had were it not for the freedom that a separation from familial obligations gave him. So I don't want to misrepresent David. I don't know if that's rote, but that was definitely the sort of feeling he was trying to give. And just one more example, Sebastian Salgado, we were talking about earlier. I don't know if you watched Salt of the Earth. This fella has a kid and then leaves for 5 years. Yeah. Like there is a tremendous opportunity cost to pursuing these things that take you away from your family versus actually being with your family, maybe being a good father, those sort of things. How have you thought about this trade-off? Because you're still not married.
I'm not married. Yeah. I mean, look, I would probably agree to the point where I probably wouldn't have been able to do a lot of what I have done if I was in a relationship or if I was married, and certainly not if I have had children, probably because you wouldn't want to. I think, that if you've got kids, then I think that the idea of just disappearing off for 5 years probably, I don't know, I'm not sure how it'd sit with me, but no, it's definitely come with the price to pay, which has often been, your partner perhaps not understanding why you want to go away so much, or might take it personally, or just sort of it runs its course because you're just away for too much, and that's definitely been a sort of part of my journey, and some of the struggles that I've had. It's been sort of conveying why it is, and I think there's a deep desire. It's not necessarily running away from something or someone. I mean, in the Art of Exploration, I talk a lot about this gene mutation, the explorer's gene, which has sort of come to the fore a little bit in some studies. It's called DRD47R, which is this allele that's sort of linked to ADHD. It's linked to basically risk-taking behavior, and it's out there in 20% of all humans, and it comes from prehistoric times when a certain number of individuals within a tribe or within a family group would be required to be the idiots that would go wandering off in search of new hunting grounds, and it's just been there within our human DNA for as long as we've been around, and I think that it's still out there now in the modern population, and it's the kind of people, it's in those people, nomads, people that are drawn to certain occupations, whether that's being an entrepreneur, being a fighter pilot, being an explorer, And it's not something you can do. There's nothing you can do about it. It's just there. It's a drive.
Yeah.
It's a very primordial emotion and sensation that I get. It's like I just can't be still for more than a few weeks or a few months at a time. And I think I just feel happier when I have a new journey to embark on.
Yeah, I can sense the eye roll at calling it an explorer's gene, but when you describe it as just a higher sensitivity to risk taking, ADHD, maybe very high energy, then it evolutionary makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, well, the old cavemen needed someone.
100%.
If you just sat in your cave, you're going to get eaten by a saber tooth.
Yeah.
You need to maybe move on, and it takes a certain type of person to be like, you know what, I'll volunteer for that. I'm going to go and wander up that valley or over that mountain and see what's on the other side.
All these Polynesians that are jumping in a canoe after the last 50 expeditions never came back.
Yeah.
And going for it anyway.
Going for it, yeah.
Spending weeks in open water. It's to the modern mind unfathomable to do. That
Absolutely
type of risk.
Wild. I met this guy in California, an Hawaiian chief, who was telling me about how his ancestors, arrived in Hawaii. So you're right, the percentage of people that came back. And he said that it was all down to visualization. He said that they would have these gatherings, they'd sit on the beach around the fire, they'd all imagine what the perfect island looked like, and off they went. Yeah. They weren't necessarily following stars or anything like that. I'm sure that was part of the navigation, but unless you knew where you were going, because like some of these guys, they just went off in a random direction. But in the full confidence they would find their next home.
Yeah, it's something else.
Which is just, it is unfathomable when you think about it.
Was there a moment when you were younger, you were in a relationship with someone who you thought, I could definitely build a life around this person, and you had to make the tough decision that, in fact, I'm not prepared to take that responsibility on. We have to part ways.
Yeah, no, that happened. I was in a relationship for quite a number of years, from the age of about 25 until my early 30s, actually, until I went and sort of set off to do my Nile journey. And we'd been together throughout my time in the army, which ironically was probably the most stable time of my life, because I knew exactly where I was going to be in 12 months' time, And then to sort of come out of that environment, and then to be in a very unstable situation of setting up businesses, sleeping on park benches, all that stuff. It was very unsettling, and not at all conducive to being in a relationship. And I had to make that decision, and it was a tough one to make, because there was definitely a time where I thought, we were going to be together forever, and I think in my mind I was kind of, on the one hand, ready for that, but on the other hand, I just had this overwhelming desire to just sort of set myself free and sort of see what happens. And I made that decision. So
you've written a book called Endurance, just over here. 100 stories of adventure, exploration, and survival. And then anecdotes of great explorers always come up through your books. So who makes up your Mount Rushmore of the greatest in history?
Greatest in history? Wow. I mean, there are certain people who obviously stand out. For me, Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta were sort of parallel greats of their time in the sort of early medieval period. Victorian explorers always pop up. The people, for me, Richard Burton is a perennial favorite, just because he was such a rogue. He was a real maverick. He spoke 27 languages. He translated the Kama Sutra. I mean, his levels of intellect and bravery / madness probably top most people.
Yeah, didn't he? He got himself circumcised as a part of his part
of his disguise. To sneak into Mecca. I mean, this
that's
guy,
skin in the game.
Yeah, I mean, he got a spear through the face on his Horn of Africa expedition, and still managed to escape with this like Somali spear through his cheeks, and pulled it out and cracked on. They were made of sterner stuff in those days. Yeah. I mean, the polar explorers intrigue me, but I mean, it's never been a thing that I've fancied. Personally, I like sort of it's not just the warmth. I like to be in environments where I meet people. I like to learn more about new cultures. The idea of going into the frozen wilderness and seeing nothing but maybe a polar bear, it doesn't necessarily excite my fancy. But I have the utmost respect for Scott, for Shackleton, for Amundsen, and so on, of course. But throughout history, there's always been these pioneers of exploration and science, and it would be interesting to sort of see who it is that pops out today. Really, I mean, in 100 years, maybe everyone will think Elon Musk was the greatest explorer of all time. Who knows?
That's a very good point. Yeah, he would probably make one of those lists.
I think he probably would.
Yeah.
In terms of what he's done through technology.
Yeah.
Let's see if he gets to Mars.
Is there a part of you that resents you weren't born in the age of exploration?
I think if I was born in the age of exploration, I'd be working down a coal mine in Stoke-on-Trent right now, because that was just
that's true. You had to have a lot of privilege, didn't you?
Well, I think it certainly helped. I mean, there's obviously exceptions to every rule, but life would have been a lot more difficult. I mean, the people did break the mold, but generally, the explorers of previous times were the ones that were born into wealth and born into privilege. On the whole, there's people like Captain Cook and so on. Livingston weren't necessarily of that ilk, but I think life would have been a lot more difficult.
Talk about my goat, Percy Fawcett.
He was a great man, yeah. I mean, he. What I was fascinated by Percy Fawcett, and I've been doing a lot more research into the Amazon of late because I'm working on a new book about trees at the moment. Was what motivated him in the first place. And there was this manuscript that was discovered in the Museum of Brazil, which was allegedly discovered by some Portuguese explorers in the 1500s when they were traveling through Brazil. And this manuscript referred to these cities of gold and these ruins that were discovered in the Amazon rainforest that by all accounts resembled Roman ruins or ancient Greek ruins with columns and arches and things like that. Which is what led not just him, but also Richard Burton. Richard Burton got a job as the governor of one of the states in Brazil.
Okay.
Bizarrely, he spent 2 years as a diplomat. No, it was in 1865, so it was after. It was it was just after his East Africa stuff. But the reality was he was out there in search of this manuscript, in search of these lost cities. So there's this idea of El Dorado or cities of gold has been omnipresent. It's only now in the last sort of 5 years that modern technology, LiDAR technology, has shown that the Amazon was never just this big empty jungle with, tribes on it. No, there was cities, there was 10 million people living in the Amazon in before Columbus arrived and before disease and, all of the stuff that came with the colonial influence killed off a lot of people. But there was huge cities. There was forest gardening has been part of the Amazon with irrigation, ditches and so on for the last sort of 10,000 years, which predates or at least is on a par with the ancient agricultural systems of Mesopotamia and the Near East. So to think that, people were living in towns, cities, and having big agricultural projects in the Amazon at the same time as ancient Iraq, it redefines our notion of history.
100%. When Percy Fawcett was trying to find this elusive lost city of Z, do you suspect that the remains of this city were as covered in foliage as they are today? Therefore, his chances of finding it were almost impossible?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the regrowth of the Amazon happened after the 16th, 17th century. So up until that point, there was a lot more people around. And then when the Spanish came and the Portuguese came, everyone just died of these European diseases, and then they ran off into the forest. But certainly by the 19th century and early 20th century, the jungle had reclaimed a lot of this, so it'd be very difficult to see. I mean, it's only now with a lot of the slash and burn farming that's going on in Brazil for cattle ranching and so on that you're now seeing these geoglyphs and a lot of these ancient monuments are finally being exposed again.
Is there a world where on one of your expeditions you literally stumble across El Dorado?
I mean, it's certainly possible. I was in Mexico with Alberto, and we were in a very populated part of Mexico, in the Yucatan, somewhere between Merida and Cancun. And we were just walking through down this main road, and we sort of went off-piste a little bit into the forest. And this young lad came up to us and was like, "Oh, do you want to come and see a pyramid?" And we're like, "There's no pyramids around here." He's like, "Oh, there is." And we're like, "What?" And off we went, and suddenly sort of felt myself walking uphill. I was like, "We're definitely going uphill." But then you remind yourself there's no like natural hills in this area, so it must be a pyramid. We climbed up and up and up, and it was all completely overgrown. You wouldn't, to look at it, you just think you were walking. Just looks like a hill. And we finally reached the summit of this hill, and you can see some slightly angular bricks that may or may not be man-made. But no, it was definitely a pyramid, and we found pottery and all sorts of stuff. And when I looked at my GPS and looked at the altitude, I think we were like 90 meters, which is higher than Chichen Itza. So like, there's pyramids out there that are literally not on any maps in the middle of Mexico, and there's thousands of these things. Yeah. So who knows what's in the middle of the jungle?
Totally. The sort of accepted wisdom is that we're so populous, everything's been discovered. We know exactly what's where. But I was in Sicily just a few weeks ago and talking to this woman there, and she was lamenting how Sicily's so bad at creating tourism for all their stuff. And she made the comparison with Rome, where, you know, it's a very affluent place. It's an open-air museum in many respects, but throughout Sicily, there are places significantly older that are just next to a road. And there's no walls around it, and there's no tourism that goes to it. But it's just downstream of whatever the economics of the local economy are that allow for the proper preservation or discovery of these places. And so if you think like, you know, the wild depths of Peru or Brazil or Colombia, you know, these economies they don't have the resources to contribute to this type of preservation or exploration and discovery. And it could just be as simple as that. There is still things to find.
There's definitely a lot out there to find. I mean, even in Egypt, you know, where very well-known excavations, they reckon they've only excavated 20% of what there is to find.
Nice.
Everything's under the sun.
That's exciting.
In Mexico, as I said, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of unexcavated ruins, and a lot of that comes down to both the fact that there is limited resources, and people don't necessarily want to sort of put the money into that. There's obviously corruption, you know, and also if you are the sort of manager of Chichen Itza and you've got this great cash cow of come and look at my pyramid, you're going to sort of block all of the other money going to all the other pyramids, right?
Totally.
And that's totally a part of
it.
There's a lot of like one-upmanship that goes on in the world, even in the world of archaeology. You know, there's a lot of jealousy. There's a lot of sort of, and you see, I mean, I was out in Saudi Arabia, which was actually fascinating because there's this pretty much undiscovered pre-Islamic scene out there that you can go out to now, and bear in mind that up until 5 years ago there was just no discussion about any sort of pre-Islamic culture in Saudi Arabia. Now they're actually quite progressive, and let's go. Yeah, it's totally changed. They've invited all these universities in to do digs. But I went out there back in just after it opened up, after 2018, and you go up to the north, to the Hejaz, Neom, and there's just thousands of flat-top mountains which you can walk up to, and every single one has got 2 or 3 prehistoric burial mounds on there, and they're 5,000-7,000 years old, and they are literally as new because of the climate. It's super dry, and it's totally undisturbed because the Bedouin wouldn't go anywhere near these things for starters, and they wouldn't touch them because it was haram.
Spiritual reasons.
And
are the Bedouin Islamic people? Of course.
They I mean, but you know, just we wouldn't disturb graves. It's sort of disrespectful. So, but you can go up to, and so we went on this dig, and you literally just pull a stone off, and there's like a 7,000-year-old body, bones, skulls, right there. Yeah. Wow. And so there's so much to see, and there's so many ancient cities in Saudi Arabia in particular that are yet to be excavated.
As a boy, how much did you romanticize Indiana Jones?
I mean, obviously, I was sort of fascinated by this idea that you could go on a quest, on a journey. I think that had a big impact. The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings. I remember my dad reading me The Hobbit when I was like 12, and I knew then that I wanted to go off and find dragons and stuff, and and it's possible in your own way, right? So I think but it was the idea of going on a journey, of coming back with new information. That sort of quest has been a huge part of what I do.
Yeah, and experiencing risk and romance
Totally.
and undiscovered culture along the way.
Yeah.
Graham Hancock, how much credence do you give to his whole worldview?
I mean, again, I think he's got season 2 coming out on Netflix
Yeah, he
soon,
does.
doesn't he?
I mean, there's a big appetite for his work, but
Absolutely.
just curious whether you...
I mean, the way I see it is, I quite like reading his stuff. It's quite entertaining. Yeah. I mean, it does lack a bit of scientific inquiry. I do, however, think that there's a lot of stuff. I mean, it's quite arrogant to think that we know it all, or to make these very bold assumptions that this happened. I mean, it was only a couple of years ago that Mr. Attenborough himself was saying, that humans only entered the Americas 12,000 years ago at the height of the last ice age over the Bering Straits, which was the conventional wisdom. That was what everyone assumed. But then, more recently they found human footprints dating back 27,000, 45,000 years.
We just have no idea, right?
So, and now there's a sort of a more wild theory that humans didn't cross over to the Americas by land at all. They came by boats, just as the Polynesians did, except they did it 50,000 years ago. Yeah. I mean, look, the Aboriginal community in Australia, they got to Australia 65,000 years ago, and they came by boat. So what's to say that people didn't populate the world, even before that, 100,000 years
Didn't
ago?
they say they walked through? From
Where?
Indonesia down
Yeah,
to
but
the
you've
top?
got to get across the bits of the bits of the sea that that
It wasn't Pangaea. It's not this long
No,
ago.
no. People, there was still bits by boat,
Yep.
and so I think we just don't know.
It is accepted that the Aboriginal population are the oldest people on the planet, right?
Yeah, I mean they are the most sort of ethnically endemic in terms of they travelled throughout Asia and they settled in Australia at a time where other communities were then usurped by later sort of iterations of Homo sapiens that came afterwards. But they, the Australian, the indigenous Australian, very very closely related and got a lot of DNA from the Denisovan human beings and so on. So it's amazing to think that. We have such a diverse gene pool out there, and yet we're only now sort of starting to piece together the story of early human migration. We know a bit, but we certainly don't know it all. We don't have the full picture.
Yeah, but it sounds like there's enough doubt. No one can be super confident about it. But I don't know. Maybe it's a discussion for geologists versus.
Yeah. Well, it is, but I think in researching this book about trees that I'm writing at the moment, a lot of that is down to the fossil record and certain assumptions. But science is progressing very quickly. I mean, AI is going to change the whole world of archaeology very soon.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier this wonderful experience he had in Saudi Arabia. He lifts off the stone. There's a 7,000-year-old skeleton in the box. Truly stumbling across ancient history. Rory Sutherland wrote this magnificent book called In Between the Places. And on his journey, he discovers this ancient, I forget the details where it was, but this ancient city that had just been repeatedly looted over time.
I think the minaret of Jam in Afghanistan.
That sounds about right. He did a nice little sketch on it in the book as a tower.
Yeah. No, Rory, I mean, I remember reading Rory, The Places in Between, back in 2004, I think, when it came out. I was 22, and that was part of the inspiration for my first big solo adventure when I hitchhiked from Nottingham, where I was a student, all the way to India, and I actually followed the same route that Rory took across Afghanistan.
No way.
Yeah.
Did you talk to him? You had interactions with him?
No, I just read the book, but it came out just as I was embarking. So I think, it was just like, all right, somebody's done this, I can follow in the footsteps. But I went the same route. I went through Chagcharan and Gore province and all these really remote areas. But it was, very remarkable, particularly in those days, to be able to go, in the wake of the Taliban having just been defeated. He'd been there sort of about a year or so before I had. But yeah, there was so much stuff. I mean, you in northern Afghanistan, you find there's places like Bulk, which was one of Alexander the Great's cities, the Wakhan Corridor, which is to this day one of the most remote and fascinating regions in the whole of Central Asia. You get these ancient Buddhist monuments on tops of mountains in a very Islamic country, so there's a lot out there.
How have you guys never come across? Yeah,
we have met. We have met. Yeah, in more recent times. We do. So he set up this thing called the Turquoise Mountain Foundation, which specializes in assisting Afghanistan's sort of heritage and protecting handicrafts and so on. And he does a bit of work with Afghan Aid, as do I. So we've met each other.
Amazing.
A couple of times, yeah.
I mean, forget left or right. To have an individual like that who took an extreme risk to truly try and understand how the world works, that type of breed does not make it to the top of politics very often.
No.
It feels like such a crazy opportunity missed.
Yeah, I mean, he's obviously a deep thinker and a very intelligent man who...
And unapologetically serious.
Yes.
Not taking the piss type. Feeding into the populace.
Well, exactly. And I think, sadly, we live in an age now where it's all about how you play the crowd, isn't it?
Yeah, what's your PR?
Yeah.
What about those operating today? Who would you want to shine a light onto in the field of pure exploration, but then as well the sort of storytelling aspect of it, which you're contributing to?
So I think in the post sort of COVID era, the world has sort of changed somewhat now, where I think exploration has gone back to being a little bit more serious. There was a point in the sort of throughout the 2000s where it was about entertainment, it was about survival, it was about, what can you eat in the desert? I think we all came to realize actually that the important things in life is community and sort of actually protecting what we've got. We live in a very fragile ecosystem, and I think the environmental causes are now more apparent than ever. We see the changeable weather, whatever your version of that you subscribe to, it's impossible to ignore the fact that we all, have a duty to live a more responsible and sustainable lifestyle. And I think those that are working in that space are the ones to be really commended. I've spent the last 3 years working with indigenous communities around the world who are doing incredible things. I was out in the Amazon a couple of years ago with a guy called Benki Piako, who's the chief of the Ashaninka community. And he's one of these characters that is very unassuming, very humble, lives in the middle of the jungle in a hut. And yet he's planted 7 million trees, a bit like Sebastian Salgado. It's like, actually, there's personal projects. He's doing his bit to protect his little corner of the Amazon. If more people did that, then I think the world would be a better place. But more than that, he's become an advocate for indigenous rights and the environmental movement internationally. The Dalai Lama invited him to India to go meet there, and he goes to Davos and he goes to COP to do these conferences. And I think that's what we should be encouraging more of is people from marginalized communities getting out there, spreading this word about how we can all learn something from that culture or indigenous culture more generally, because actually they are the guardians of a way of life that we've kind of become quite disconnected to. And so that's what I would say is actually we can learn a lot from people that live more in balance with nature.
And so with your work, you're going to try and profile these
totally,
types of stories more.
Yeah. That's what I'd like to do more of is actually just giving a voice to people who live in harmony with nature, because that's certainly what, I'm saying that from a second floor flat in Battersea, but I keep threatening that I'm going to go live in the woods at some point, right. which I will.
What about those exclusively that are just fantastic writers and really bringing the pure thrill and adventure and discovery of a place through a book? Right now is operating.
Yeah, Leon McCarron is a great writer. He's a good mate of mine. He picks such niche topics, though. I sort of hope that he will become more mainstream. But he's a great author. He's written about the Middle East extensively, about the Tigris River, and he's writing about the Hejaz at the moment. there's some really, really good writers. Ben Timberlake is a good friend of mine. His book High Risk is very entertaining. I don't know if you've read that, but it's he was an ex-SAS guy that sort of got a bit carried away, but he's the real deal. He is like Indiana Jones personified. He just goes around.
Oh, that's great. Ben Timberlake.
Ben Timberlake, you should get him on. He's he wrote a book called High Risk. It deserves a read because
cool.
He I won't spoil it for you, but go and
I imagine the lead isn't buried in the title there.
No, it's but he goes in search of stolen artifacts around the world and chasing down the bad guys and all sorts of stuff.
It is Indiana Jones.
Yeah. He is genuinely the real deal. So there's there are some people out there doing incredible things. A friend of mine, Lucy Shepherd, she's got a show on Channel 4 coming out soon. She was out there in the Amazon as well, living with indigenous communities. So yeah. And then obviously the old classics, people like Rand Fines, who's been a real pioneer over the years of encouraging people to just go out there and have adventures.
And brandished a few of your books, I think, with
yeah.
quotes.
He's been very generous to sort of read them and.
Why is everyone British that does this?
Because have you seen the weather outside? We like to get out of here and escape.
Or is it something more deeply rooted as a part of your culture, having been this group of ethnic people that really went across the entire planet and left their mark?
Well, that, and also the fact that we are a complete melting pot of other cultures. We've got people. It's people say, "What is English? What is the sense of being British?" And it's we come from so many cultures, and I think because we live on a little island, I think that claustrophobia is probably the biggest motivation. Yeah. We're a nation of seafarers. If you go back far enough, we've got a lot of Viking blood and so on. But it's really, I think, a sense that. It's a sense of, right, we need to get off this island and go and see what's out there, really.
And maybe also a consequence of just English language. That's who we happen to see, but there could be
there's amazing representatives of every country out there. I mean, I've met some fantastic explorers from Oman. I met this great lady in Pakistan who's a motorbike pioneer and does these great motorbike journeys all over the world. There's explorers, and thankfully, I think because of one of the benefits of social media is that it's becoming more accessible now, and it's a great thing to see. I think travel, tourism, for all of its all of the things that you might level against the idea of mass tourism, I think it's a great way of breaking down barriers, of encouraging dialogue and bringing people together.
Mm-hmm. You crossed the Darien Gap. What year was that?
2016.
Did you watch Bald and Bankrupt's video recently doing the same? Have you heard of Bald and Bankrupt?
Yeah, I've heard of him, but I haven't seen it,
What do you think? I was going to ask you what you think about this sort of new generation of guys just with a handy cam.
Yeah, I mean, why not? Absolutely. I mean, there's a whole bunch of YouTubers out there that are actually doing things on a budget without the support of a film crew that get out there. I mean, if I was 10 years younger, I'd probably be doing the same. Yeah.
Do you think about social media, what you could do to blow up a big newsletter or a big YouTube channel?
I think I'm worried that I've missed the boat on that. I don't know. Maybe I could do more
it's
with
never too late.
I just don't think I spend enough time thinking about it, and I think because I've been quite lucky getting the TV stuff, it's not something that I've really spent too much time on. But if there's an audience out there, I mean, I do sometimes. I mean, I've spoke to a TV producer the other day who said they make more money out of their YouTube videos than they do of their actual films that they sell.
Can you reveal what channel that was?
Well, I wouldn't want to embarrass the channel for paying such low rates. But,
right.
But the point, they were an independent production company that mainly sell adventure shows. But they said they do make more cash out of what they put on YouTube than what they sell.
I mean, that's such a great signal,
wild.
Leading indicator for how media is changing,
it's
being consumed differently.
Completely smashed the way that we think about things. And frankly, if I was intelligent, I probably should just bin off the TV and just do stuff for YouTube.
Right. Just rustle up a couple of blokes you trust to edit, to film, and then you own the entire means of production.
Totally. Yeah.
What do you think is the most consequential work you've ever done?
I think probably the Nile, just because it was what started everything. Now, whether that is I mean, yeah, again, we go back to the point of like, how do you trace it all back? I think the Nile for me was sufficiently big and mad enough and dangerous enough, which was demonstrated in some of the things that happened on that journey, to make it sort of noteworthy. And I mean, it's interesting because it's the 10-year anniversary this year, and the publishers are bringing out a 10-year anniversary book. I never thought I'd be doing sort of 10-year anniversary specials, but that's the kind of the point. It was it did receive international acclaim, and it did touch a lot of people's hearts, I think, and it sort of brought attention to a region that is often sort of considered a bit of a backwater, and so for me that still has a very poignant sort of emotion connected to it. I mean, I try not to think about it because it was such a big part of my life, and it had such a big impact on my life. Sometimes I hark back to the times before the Nile where everything did change, where I was living in a sort of slightly more contented place, because it was such a harrowing journey. I try not to think about it too much.
Right.
Yeah.
So much has happened to you in 10 years.
Yeah, it's been a busy 10 years.
Yeah, when I look at your profile, when I'm doing research for this interview, my assumption is this has been a 20-year career, even more, But it really is only 10 years since you came on the map.
Yeah, and I've been very fortunate. I think a lot of that was going back to your point of like making sacrifices. Yeah, I sort of devoted myself in the years following the Nile to just really maintaining that momentum, and every year do another big expedition, 6 months, 7 months, 8 months away every single year, and that did that that paid off. But it meant that I've been literally non-stop, and it's only really since COVID that I've managed to sort of actually take any time off and have a proper holiday. So COVID came at a time that was probably actually quite welcomed in a way, because it meant that I was forced to stop and evaluate what I was doing and why I was doing it. What
print run is the Nile River book into?
That's a good question. I don't know, actually. That's a very good question. It's definitely it's still out there and still selling.
Have you noticed with all of the work you produced, which have been sold better than others?
The Nile and the Himalayas are the best sellers to this day. The Himalayas, interestingly, did really well in India.
Oh, nice.
To the point where the show did really well in India. I actually got a TV show commissioned directly from Discovery Channel India 2 years ago. So I made a show called Expedition Borderlands with my mate Ash Bhardwaj, where we
guest on the podcast.
Yeah, there we go. So we did this journey from Ladakh through Kashmir down to Punjab and then up the Pakistan side, but purely for a domestic Indian audience, which I never thought was
that's hectic.
Yeah,
okay.
which was wild, really.
Yeah.
So those two are the most sort of the ones that resonated the most. Which is interesting, because I thought something like The Art of Exploration would have probably done better, but again, that came out in the middle of COVID, so maybe it was just bad timing. So
how do you think about risk?
Yeah.
Were you really, really well educated in how to mitigate risk, avoid risk, assess risk through your military training, or is this something innate that you just learned through experience over the years?
Probably both. I think, ironically, the military is very risk averse. By definition, you're all about mitigating risk, and so you don't actually take that many risks in the army, unless you're literally
surprising to hear.
Yeah. But unless you're literally
jumping out of planes, right?
But it's so well organized and so well regulated. Actually, the riskiest things I ever did were nothing to do with the military. It was being off on expeditions. So a lot of that is purely down to experience. Experiencing the ground truth of what it's like being in difficult situations where you've only got your own wits to get you out of it. And a lot of that is just understanding human nature. It's basic psychology. And that's stuff that I learned from being out in Africa or Asia on my own and suddenly being sat in a cave with a bunch of mujahideen. How do you just got to you charm them, or you offer them a cigarette or something, that gets them on that human level. You need to do your homework, of course. You need to know a bit about the basic culture and etiquette, but really it's just about trying to be as personable and sort of non-threatening usually as you can be.
Something that stood out to me from Rory's book, In Between the Places, was this almost throwaway of risk, risk be damned, because he would be going into these villages a week after 9/11 and they would be very hostile to him. And he would say to them quite bluntly, "Are you not a good Muslim? Do you not give hospitality to travelers? Your enemy just down the road gave me a bed to sleep in last night.
Yeah.
Are you not a good Muslim?" Like the balls to do that. So risky. And he wasn't traveling with any tent, sleeping bag.
Yeah.
To not sleep indoors, especially when a lot of his trip was in the cold, is death.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I remember reading about that when I was in Chagcharan in the middle of Afghanistan it was November 2004, and I'd just been in this horrific car accident where I was in a little minivan with like 16 people crammed into an 8-seater, and the brakes failed and ended up, like, thankfully, rather than going off the edge of a cliff, it crashed into a lorry that had, to this day, I don't know how, but the only other vehicle we'd seen all day happened to be parked on the bend just as our brakes failed. So we smashed into this lorry. The driver would, like, his legs were completely chopped off, sadly, but we survived this trip. And then I was like stuck in this very remote town in the middle of nowhere. And the only person I found that would take me in was this young sort of 20-year-old lad who invited me into his house, which was very nice of him. But then I found out that they were all opium smugglers and, like, affiliated to the Mujahideen and all this sort of stuff. And after like 3 or 4 days there, I just knew I needed to get out there. And he wouldn't let me go. He was like, "No, you must stay, and you must stay." So I ended up having to, like, sort of sneak out the window.
You just bailed.
Just had to bail and like leave across the desert at like 3 a.m. And I remember walking across this desert in the middle of Afghanistan, dressed in my shalwar kameez, listening to the wolves howling in the mountains, thinking, "What the fuck am I doing?" But yeah, I mean, those sorts of memories, I look back now and think, that was absolutely insane. Yeah. But I had a lot more appetite for risk when I was in.
It must feel glorious to remember that.
It does.
That pure freedom.
Like, I wouldn't do it now.
Yeah, man. Languages, when you go, so you learn Spanish in Mexico.
A little bit, yeah.
What about, say, the other parts of the world you've gone through? Have you made a big attempt to know enough?
I'm terrible
to say
at
who
languages.
You are?
I'm terrible. I'm not a good linguist at all. I mean, I can probably say hello and thank you in most of the languages that I've encountered, but that's probably it. Which is why I think it's all the more important to try and find local people to travel with who can not only act as your translator and your linguist and your guide, but also just so you've got that little extra insight into the culture.
You can actually mold into the tapestry.
Yeah.
Rather than just
often, certainly when I was younger, I relished the idea of going somewhere where nobody spoke English and just trying to get by. Yeah. That element of surprise and chance and risk, I thrived on that.
Yeah, that's amazing. How do you de-escalate situations that could be threatening, potentially hostile, when you can't speak the same language as them?
I mean, I found this particularly on my Nile journey and a lot of my East Africa journeys, actually. I'll never forget it was 2011. I just left the army. I was setting up Secret Compass, and I was on this recce in South Sudan, which I think it was just before they'd been made in a sort of independent country. I'd been invited to go on this rafting trip from Nimale on the Uganda border to Juba, which is a very remote stretch of river filled with crocodiles and hippos. Yeah. But the journey itself was uneventful. We'd spent 5 days on this raft, and apart from being snapped at a couple of times, we're absolutely fine. On a final approach, about 10 miles outside of Juba, as we were sort of relaxing, thinking we'd almost made it, suddenly heard this shouting from the riverbank, and all these men started running down the riverbank, started firing warning shots over our heads from their AK-47s. We were like, shit, like, what's going on? And they were like, stop. And we couldn't stop. We were in a raft and we were going down rapids, So they chased after us in dugout canoes. It was literally like being in an Indiana Jones film, as they were like shooting over our heads. And eventually they caught up with us. They pulled the canoes over, dragged us out, lined us up against the riverbank, hands behind our heads, and we thought, this is it. We're going to get shot in the back of the head. And the only thing I could think to do, and I'd brought them just for this sort of occasion, because I'd been told, always carry a packet of cigarettes. Good advice. So my captor, who was this like Dinka, warrior, facial scarification, looked pretty brutal. I sort of pulled out a cigarette and he sort of, what are you doing? And I sort of offered him one. And you could see the cogs turn. He was like, he really wanted a cigarette, but he was looking around to see if his like boss would let. He was like, he took one, and then he like lit up, and then his boss wanted one, and before you know it, it was all fine. We'd sort of de-escalated the situation. But that was a risk, because he might have just like, we genuinely thought something bad could happen here.
Just take all your stuff, leave you guys behind.
Yeah. So I think ultimately it just comes down to just sort of trying to find common ground in any scenario. I found this on my Nile journey. We'd been stopped by some militia group in, I think, Tanzania. And this guy was like, "You're CIA, you're a spy." I was like, No. He's like, "You're military." And I was like, No. And I was military. And he's like, "I know you're military," because I was wearing my old army belt and like my army boots. And that was obviously a dead giveaway. And as a result, he robbed me of my boots and my belt because he wanted them. But like what I learned was just be honest, just be like, yeah, I was military. And then actually when I found was like, oh, okay, what rank were you, which regiment? And like actually when you've got that common ground, doesn't matter what the scenario or which side you're supposed to be on, that helped a lot. I mean, when I was on my Arabia journey in 2017 in Iraq, I managed to interview this guy called Abu Tassin, who was his nickname was the Hawkeye. He was one of Iraq's most feared snipers. He'd killed like 400 people, including lots of Brits and Americans. This guy was on the bad guy's side. But he agreed for an interview with me because he said the only reason that he did give me that interview was, one, I didn't work for the BBC, and two, I was, an ex-soldier, and in his eyes, a sort of an equal, or what, that camaraderie that comes with that.
Yeah.
Quite a very strange sensation speaking to somebody who has killed your comrades or your countrymen. But
how'd you manage that? Could you empathise with him at all?
Yeah, this guy didn't have much life going on behind those eyes. There was a lot of darkness, very cold. But equally, I felt like it was a conversation that we needed to have. In the sort of sense of, I mean, he was fighting against ISIS, so we were technically on the sort of same side now. But very, very, interesting. I mean, he was actually killed a week after I'd interviewed him by ISIS. Yeah.
Detail from The Art of Exploration, which is impossible to forget, is this hazing process you guys go through, where you just grab each other by the collar and hit each other until someone gives up. Could you explain what that is?
What, in milling, you mean?
Yeah, I forget. Milling was what it's called, exactly.
Yeah.
Could you explain what that is? And does that still happen as a part of the process?
In the paras?
Yeah.
Yeah, so no, milling is part of P Company, which is the selection criteria to be in the airborne forces. And it's been that way since the Second World War. And it's you're in a ring, you're not allowed to move back or sort of like move out of the way. So you literally just punch each other in the face for a minute, solid. And it's just a test of endurance, and like to show your grit and resilience. But to this day, it's a tried and tested way of showing controlled aggression.
And does everyone make it through?
No. If you back out, or if you duck out, or if you back away, then that's you out.
They'll get rid of you.
Yeah.
Wow. It's surprising to hear that, given whatever the political environment might be.
No, it's good to see a bit of
waved out. Yeah.
Yeah, some things don't change. Yeah. And now females are allowed in, so they also could do it as well. Are
they forced to line up with a guy?
I don't know I think they go up against the female PTIs actually.
So what do you do if you're an elite athlete to a degree, and you're very highly skilled and technical and intelligent and all the rest, but then you are lined up against a significantly stronger person than you? Is that also just a part of the pride? Like you can cop it no matter how big they are?
So interestingly, they generally put you up against your own weight category, unless you're an officer, in which case they put you up against the biggest meatiest corporal
with the biggest hands.
And so they put me up against this huge guy covered in tattoos. Like this, I was like, oh, dear, this is But they, because everyone watches as well.
Yeah,
so it's not like you've got. And I actually won. Yeah. He was an engineer, but I actually somehow managed to win this fight. And it was interesting because afterwards, like, we sat down and we were having a laugh about it, me and this corporal. He's like, yeah, I can't believe they put me up against a parachute regiment officer. He was actually intimidated, not by my size, because I'm not a particularly big bloke, but just I think the mental thing. It was like the idea of a parachute regiment officer comes with this this brand, this sort of thing. And I found that I always felt like I always had this imposter syndrome that I was an officer in the parachute regiment, which sounds very impressive, but it took a lot of getting used to, because that comes with a sort of a reputation. And to this day, you ask me which work has been most impactful. I think genuinely passing P Company and getting that maroon beret enabled all of this, because it was that simple. By sticking at that week-long course, running around with a burger on my back, doing my milling, all that stuff, it was only that maroon beret that opened the door to everything else. I don't think I would have had the balls to go and walk the Nile if I hadn't have had the balls to do that 1 minute of milling. I wouldn't have had the courage to go and meet the commissioning editors at Channel 4 and say, I'm going to go and do this journey, because they wouldn't have. They were like, well, who are you? It was only because they were like, oh, you're a para. You're an officer in the paras. Of course you're going to do it.
So it's a really high status
Totally.
job. Okay. Yeah. For my Australian, US, anyone not in the UK, could you explain what the significance is of being an officer in the paras?
Well, so the parachute regiment is, along with the Marines, probably the two most elite units in the regular army. You've obviously got the SAS and the Special Forces that do their thing, but within the army, it's the sort of, you're the top of your game. And as an officer, you were a commander in that unit. So I was in charge of 30 soldiers on the battlefield, and I think there's no greater privilege than as a 24, 25-year-old to be in charge of such highly qualified, highly motivated men in a high-risk scenario.
And were they all younger than you?
No, some of them much older. I was 23, 24. A lot of the soldiers are quite young, but, the sergeants, the sergeant majors, the colour sergeants, these are guys who are in their sort of, 30, 35, and you're their boss, which is quite intimidating to be a boss of somebody 10 years older than you with a lot more experience. But it's a great symbiotic relationship, because they've got the experience, but you've got the education and the leadership training that it takes. And also at that age, you're in your prime, you're fit. And you're expected as an officer to be fitter than most of your men, if not all of them. There's always going to be a couple of hardcore racing snakes, but you're expected to be faster, stronger, more motivated, don't sleep, all that than everybody else.
Wow.
And that's why they respect you.
What did you display in the recruitment process that pinned you as someone for leadership material?
You know what? Interestingly, it was the boxing element that got me through. When I was at Sandhurst, the leadership training academy, you were allowed two choices, and I'd gone for my local regiment, the Staffordshire Regiment, and I'd gone for the intelligence corps because I fancied doing all this sort of sneaky beaky spy stuff. But in my second term of the college, I took up boxing, and I'd been selected after 14 weeks of training out of the 50 or so people that had been training to actually fight on the Sandhurst Fight Night, which is quite a privilege because they only select the top 20 to fight in front of 2,000 people, including you get the general coming, you get all the local governors and the politicians, and so it's a big night. And I won my boxing bout, and as a result, I was invited into the sergeant's mess. And the para representative came up to me and said, which regiment are you joining? I said, well, my two choices are the Staffords, my local regiment, or the Intelligence Corps. And he was like, no, bullshit, you're joining the paras. And I was like, I don't think I'm good enough. He's like, look, if you're good enough to stand in a ring in front of 2,000 people, you're good enough for the paras. And he literally sat me down there, and then I had like a pint in my hand, and he did the interview. And there'd already been 100 people selected down to the top 12.
Yeah.
And off the back of that interview, he selected me to be in the final selection, the final shortlist. I mean,
this is a phenomenal moment of serendipity.
Exactly, that's what I mean. But it was all down to being in the ring and like putting yourself. It's the old Roosevelt speech of the man in the arena. You've got to be in it to win it.
And you went to Sandhurst. That's the same one Churchill went to, right?
Churchill, I think he went to Woolwich. In those days, there was two. No, he did go to Sandhurst. Yeah, I mean, it's the leadership academy that all army officers go to. No, he did go to Sandhurst.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry, I know we've gone for quite a while.
That's all right.
Might be a few more here. So as you get older and more experienced, every experience you take accumulates, and so your actual adventures and the way you see the world is always changing, right? So it's hard to know what the answer to my question is that's coming now. But if you could keep that constant, imagine you had the same experience as the very first time you went out to the world. how has the nature of travel changed in your lifetime? Not for you, generally.
I think the biggest change has been phones. It's been the internet. When I first went backpacking as a young 18-year-old around Thailand and Australia and all that stuff. It was the most formative, incredible time of my life because I was disconnected, because I was going off a guidebook. I'd have my Lonely Planet, or I'd, maybe sort of rip a page out, and that would be my guide. I had no other reference point other than that. And most importantly, talking to people. You'd go out there and you'd get talking on a bus to some random stranger, local or another foreigner, and that would take you off on another journey. They'd be like, oh, well, come to my house, or let's go to this island, or whatever it might be. And I loved that. That was what got me into travel in the first place, was just being completely disconnected from my home environment and just going off into the world. There was no TripAdvisor, there was no Google Maps, there was no Booking.com. And that, I think, has been the sad part of travel, is now people just, you stay in a hostel or something like that. People are just on their phones.
On the phone the whole time.
And that's so sad. People don't talk to each other. We used to just go and meet so many people, and that's what I really look back on fondly. And I'm so glad that I lived the last of that time in history where people had the ability to.
They're open to the serendipity.
Yeah, and also we there was no option. You'd have to talk to people, and that was what develops character, I think. I do feel sorry for this generation now that don't have that opportunity to be disconnected, and people are scared. They imagine turning your phone off for a whole day. I mean, I did it for a year. You wouldn't have a phone. Like, it was, if you wanted to communicate with your family, I told them I would send them one email a month. I'd go and find an internet cafe, and I'd send them an email.
I'm still alive.
Yeah.
See you in 6 months.
And that was it. And it was great. But people can't handle being away from their phone for half an hour these days.
It is such a shame, obviously. What are the downstream consequences of that for how people's experiences of these other cultures end up being? Because if you don't expose yourself to whatever the serendipity might be of the person in the hostel, of the person on the bus, then whatever your experience of the country when you return might be, food was all right, kind of boring, bit dirty, nice beaches though, Whereas if you'd had an adventure otherwise, you would have maybe experienced this whole different way of the culture.
Well, it also just becomes a bit more manufactured, where you can still have an adventure, but it's not. I don't know how real it is when it's all planned through TripAdvisor. Or I think there's a lot to be said for just leaving things entirely down to chance. And also, when you've got half your mind thinking about, whether your girlfriend, boyfriend's texting you, or maybe, can I get that perfect shot for Instagram and see how many likes I can get? It's just all bullshit. Like, you're splitting your brain in two. It forces you to be schizophrenic because you can't be fully present. You can't be fully present if you're thinking about what's going on in your phone, which is a complete portal to somewhere else. Yep. And I think that's the problem with the
antithesis of why you went away in the first place.
Totally. Yep. If you want to travel. Do it without the distraction of being torn apart, which is what I think, sadly, this constant, having this device does to us.
Speaking of the distractions, you've walked thousands and thousands of kilometers. Did you ever have audiobooks in, podcasts, music?
For that exact reason, I didn't. No, I didn't listen to music. I didn't listen to any podcasts. I was, I mean, one, your batteries run out pretty quickly in the middle of the Sahara. But two, I genuinely found it was such a great opportunity to be completely present and to have conversations. When you're walking with your guide, you learn so much. Or just you can get quite meditative. I was sort of in this flow where I was just enjoying the environment. I mean, don't get me wrong. There was times of complete misery when you're so bored and so lonely and so isolated. But that's part of the beauty of it. I look back and I'd love to have a month of not speaking to anyone for right now, to be honest.
So you're doing this stuff in the Amazon with the trees.
Yeah.
Do you have a big TV adventure lined up?
I'm hoping to the book's called The Great Tree Story, which will be coming out next year. But I'd love to turn that into a TV option as well. I think there's some incredible science that's coming out now about tree communication, intelligence in nature, which is mind-blowing stuff. How trees communicate through the fungal networks. So that's something I'm particularly interested in now is that human connection to nature through what is probably the most visible embodiments of that, trees. I'm always pitching new ideas. I mean, that's the one of the biggest parts of my job is the sort of the business development side of things is like constantly pitching new ideas.
What about Australia?
I'd love to do it. I'd love to come and travel in Australia in a way that would be, I think for me that something that would be really exciting would be to go and spend time, and learn more about Indigenous,
definitely
Aboriginal culture, spending time in the desert. I mean, I haven't been back to Australia since I was there as a backpacker in 2001. I haven't been back since, so I'd love to come back. I'm sure it's changed.
Nice. The publishing market for travel books, what does that look like?
Dreadful. The travel section in whether it's Waterstones, W.H. Smith is always pretty minuscule, unless you go to somewhere great like Stanford's, which is specialist in travel. It's sadly still regarded as a small niche, and as a result, it's if you're on the travel shelves, you're limiting yourself to a pretty small market. So that's one of the reasons I've tried to sort of expand a bit and do something slightly different with the more environmentally focused books. I wrote a book called The Last Giants about elephants. Working on this tree book. I'm doing some fiction. I've just working on a couple of scripts as well for a couple of Hollywood movies. Nice. But this is all job creation. It's because the travel market is so small, which is surprising because you'd think actually more people are traveling, but people, if they go on holiday, they usually want to read some naff, fiction.
So you're writing fiction. Is these scripts for movies in development, or you want to pitch them?
One is in development now, so that's
amazing.
That's happening.
Who's the protagonist? What's the story?
I'm not sure I'm allowed to talk too much about it, but it's about Afghanistan. It's about the war there. Is
this an extension from the Fall of Kabul?
Yes, similar, related to that. And then I've actually just directed a short film as well, which nice. I'm hoping will, I'll take that on the film circuit this year and the festival circuit rather, and see if we can turn that into a feature film.
And what's that about?
That's kind of about a veteran's mental health journey. It's actually a modern adaptation of Homer's Odyssey, so it's kind of like this hero's journey of somebody who comes back from conflict, but it's all set within a modern day setting of a festival. So it's kind of trippy and weird and a bit wild. But
is that why you've been writing a lot about Burning Man recently?
Well, it's all about it's kind of this idea of what happens when you're isolated at a festival. It will make sense when you watch it, I hope.
I love it. And fictional book as well.
And I'm working on a novel as well. Yeah.
What's the story there?
Similar, but on a global scale. So it's not about a festival, but it's about the idea of, I don't know if you know Homer's Odyssey, but the idea that this guy is trying to get home to his wife, but keeps getting waylaid by all these distractions, the sirens, the Cyclops, and all that. But what I've done is turn those into the modern day iterations.
So you're clearly very creative, right? And you've expressed it in all these different ways. During all of your expeditions, I imagine you would have stumbled across a lot of very interesting and also consequential journalistic stories. Have you ever been interested in pursuing more journalism, pure journalism?
Yeah, I mean, I have done that in the past. When I was doing Secret Compass stuff, I would go off and do embeds. Back in I think 2014, 15, around then, I was embedded with the Peshmerga in Kurdistan fighting ISIS. I was writing about conflict stuff. I was doing various missions out in South Sudan, writing about the conflict there. So, I do make that a part of what I do. Over the years, I've done quite a lot of writing for the Telegraph on NATO exercises, things like that. So, yeah, I have done that. But I found that my work in bringing some of those stories to the mainstream is more effective when you can add it subtly into the expedition, the adventure stuff, because you can bring it to a much bigger audience that way.
Like this cutaway interview with the sniper.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I was shocked 2 days ago. I walked into Waterstones Piccadilly, went downstairs to the travel area. I always like to just see, who have I interviewed here, how are their books doing, so forth. And I asked the lady what the best-selling book was for the last month. And she said The Lonely Planet Japan a travel guide.
Yeah.
Which shocked me. How are people still buying physical travel guides?
I'm glad they are, but it's surprising.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you're surrounded by, in my opinion at least, when you do go to a place, whether it's Japan or Indonesia or whatever, pick up some book that is either fictional or non-fictional of someone's adventure there. And I feel like that's, to read those stories whilst you're in the country is super rich. When I've moved to Amsterdam, I just found the first Amsterdam book. It was called Murder in Amsterdam. And it's about, I'm going to forget the guy's name, hard right-wing politician who was murdered back in the day. And then Ayaan Hirsi Ali enters the story. And then it told a story of the political response to immigration in the Netherlands. But then it was also a sort of murder scene throughout Amsterdam. And it was magical. It was such a good thing to be reading while I was there. When I was in Mexico, it was The Open Veins of Latin America by Eduardo Galeano. Didn't know my difference between my left and right in politics at the time. I've since come to learn it was a very communistic book. But it was amazing to be reading that whilst you're in the country anyway.
I love that. I find reading local literature is a gateway to understanding a bit more about the culture, and that I've always tried to do that. But yeah, it's a really interesting landscape right now. I mean, travel literature, as I've found, comes in waves. There's been many years, particularly obviously in COVID, it kind of died a death, but it is taking more of a resurgence now, which is great to see, and there's some great new authors coming through.
2 more for you, mate. Which country are you most bullish on?
In what respect? What do you mean? Like,
not from a financial perspective, but a place that you reckon has a great future.
There's a couple of countries that have done a real pivot, like Colombia, for instance. Went through some very hard times, had a bit of a bad rep, but that's now become this incredible hub for digital nomads and people traveling there. I think that's got a huge amount of potential. I've always loved Greece. Like, Greece has been one of my favorite go-to places, and it has got this perennial sort of vibe, I think. And I hope it's taken sort of second fiddle in the Mediterranean to places like Portugal, but I really hope that Greece can do what Portugal has tried to do and become a hub for the sort of this creativity and this sort of digital nomad vibe, because it's got so much potential.
Yeah. And finally, Lev, what great adventure, expedition of history, if you could join as part of the crew, which would you join?
Gosh. I think some of those early Nile exploration journeys. I think that the Speke and Burton Great Lakes journeys of the 1850s, I probably would have joined that, just because I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall, seeing how those two were rowing the whole time.
Yeah. And the context for that exhibition was they were discovering, at least from the British perspective,
it was this idea of where did this mystical river come from, which had defeated European explorers for so many centuries. The Romans sent legions up the Nile and they all vanished, probably down to malaria. It was only really in the mid 1800s that of course people, the Africans have been never left, but the idea that people didn't know where this river came from is remarkable.
Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you, but I just had a thought.
Go.
Do you finish your thought?
Yeah.
Okay. You're a scholar on the history of adventure in many respects. And you've dedicated books to that subject. Did you ever catch wind of, say, some ancient Egyptian who made his way up to Scandinavia, or a Native American who made his way down to the bottom of Chile? Epic journeys that just were never recorded.
Oh, totally. I mean, I think we haven't even scratched the surface of intercontinental travel in ancient times. The Roman Empire's biggest trading partner was India, and people forget this. The Romans got all of the color blue in art, in jewelry, all came from lapis lazuli, which was mined in northern Afghanistan. That's where the Romans got the colour pigment from. Obviously you got Marco Polo in the Middle Ages and this trade then, but this goes back for hundreds of years before then. The ancient Phoenicians were trading. The Vikings were trading down the Black Sea. They uncovered a gold ring in Sweden with Arabic inscription on it. These people were trading. The Vikings found North America a long time before Columbus. The Vikings and the Inuit were trading partners in the north for hundreds of years. And who's to say that thousands of years before that, people weren't... I mean, look, it took me 9 months to walk up the Nile, right? That wasn't that long. People have been walking around the world for thousands of years, and I'm sure they were all talking and chatting and communicating and trading in ways that they just didn't happen to write a best-selling book about.
Yeah, totally. All right, mate. Well, so generous of your time. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this with me.
Pleasure.
And
great to chat.
Yeah, I'm sure that the people listening will have enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Cheers, mate.